Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we're continuing our coverage of the second tournament in the 2019 Grand Prix Series. This one's based out of Latvia. The Grand Prix Series, if you're not familiar, it's a 4-tournament series. At the end of it, the top 2 players get a berth into the Canada's tournament next year. Winner of that tournament does go on to face Magnus Carlsen for the World Championship. Each player is assigned 3 tournaments they play in, so they don't play all 4, but they're trying to accumulate as many points as they can in each of the Grand Prix tournaments. This is a heads-up battle. There's 16 players in each of the tournaments, and you play a best-of-2 series. If you beat your individual opponents, then you go on to the next round, and we get into the quarters, and then eventually the semis and the finals. So, best of 2 in round 1, game number 1. A lot of draws, meaning that in game number 2 in round 1, if there's one side that gets the victory, they will move on to their next opponent, where everyone else, if there's 2 draws, they will have some tiebreak game. So our competitors today, White's going to be played by the youngster, 23-year-old Daniel Dubov. He's a Russian grandmaster. Very fun player to watch. If you haven't seen him, he's extremely creative, goes down lines that we don't see a lot of others go down. So fun to see him in this tournament. He was the organizer's nominee, so you have a certain number of players that are in here based on the rating, and then a few for each of the tournaments that the organizers can put in there just to make sure that they have 16 competitors for all 4 of the tournaments. His opponent playing the black piece is the number 8th ranked player in the world, and that is Mamedyarov. So we'll go ahead and get into the action. Starts out with knight to f3. Black respawns knight to f6. We see pawn c4, pawn c5, so this still could be lots of different options as far as the opening. Knight here to c3, pawn d5, and then after knight to d5, pawn d4, we do see the knight come down here to c3. The pawn recaptures, and then pawn to g6. So this is the Grunfeld. This is the exchange variation as we see here. And usually the exchange just is looking at the pawns here. Black doesn't always capture here on c3. The main difference in this Grunfeld and all the other Grunfelds we've ever covered is it's not common that this knight here is here on f3. Many times you'll see the pawn push forward to e4, which is exactly what we see in this game, but the knight's still here on g1. Later, you'll see the knight come to e2. Many times that follows the bishop here on c4. So the knight on f3, it even started. That was the very first move that Daniel played. Is extremely uncommon. Now, in the exchange variation, if you're not extremely familiar with it, you can see that White has a strong presence in the center of the board. So Black tries to do 2 things. One, tries to bring his pawn here to c5 to break up that pawn structure, which he did very early. The second move, that's exactly what Shakir played. And then he also wants to bring his bishop here to g7. Just put another piece attacking the center here on d4. So we see bishop to g7. And then bishop here to b5. Since the knight's not going to be coming here to e2, doesn't have to worry too much about what's going to happen with this bishop. So it decides to go ahead and get it outside this pawn chain, attack this king right here, get ready to castle on his own, and knight to c3. Knight's being pinned down right here. Castle on the king side, bishop to e3. This does open up for semi-open file if wants to bring his rook here to b1, start to attack as well. Does not want to go ahead and exchange right now. He has a great bishop here. He has control of the center of the board. He's the one that controls if he wants to open up the board state, and so you don't want to give up your bishop pair here so early. Bishop comes down here to g4, pinning down the knight. Completely okay, pushes forward with pawn to d5, attacking the knights. Knight decides to come down to e5, putting another attacker on this knight on f3. And really need to bring the bishop back here to e2. And that's exactly what Daniel plays. There's no other good option. If there is some exchange here, you don't want to end up recapturing with your pawn on f3. It completely exposes your king here, and Black can just put a lot of pressure. So correctly brings his bishop down here to e2, and we start to see some exchange. Knight takes on f3, bishop takes here, and then the queen recaptures on f3. Now, one thing you'll notice this did do is leaves this pawn here on c3 under attack. Bishop still here on g7, so it decides to come down and take the pawn here on c3. Now, white can recapture this, but first he has to recognize that the rook here on a1 is under attack. So he would like to just start out with bishop takes on c5, get that same pawn back. Now it's discovered attack this bishop right here, but then the bishop can just freely take here on a1. So it has to deal with that first and correctly just plays rook to b1. Gets that out of harm's way, also attacks this pawn here on b7. Plays pawn to b6, and while yes, this is solidifying the pawn chain and protects this, Daniel can still take freely with his bishop here, because if the pawn takes, then the queen can just come over here and capture on c3. So Serkir has some options as far as how he wants to continue. He decides to bring his rook over here to c8. He does not want to give up his bishop, and so this is one way to go about doing that. Now, we still could see an exchange on the board, but instead of that exchange, we see the bishop come down here to e3. Queen to d7. Rook over here to a c1, just trying to control the queen side of the board. No side really has a strong attack right here. It's pretty even in the game. This bishop on c3, it's not really able to do too much. All the pawns right here on light squares and doesn't have too much of the material involved into the game. The rook here on f8 eventually would like to get involved. Still has not pushed his central pawn here on e7. So Shakir has done a good job of defending. Neither side really has a strong attack here. Pawn to f5 is where things start to shift, and black says, I want to start going for a strong attack here. And so after pawn f5, we see pawn g3. Does not want to have to worry about this pawn coming to f4. He could eventually bring his bishop back here to e5, putting more pressure on this square right here, and especially with his rook here on f8. Just doesn't want to have to deal with that, so decides to go and push up with pawn g3. Bishop now comes back to f6, bishop to f4, and then the pawn takes on e4. And this changes quite a bit in the game. Did not have to take this material, had a lot of different options. As soon as he takes this, there's now an isolated pawn here on d5. Isolated pawns don't have pawns on either side of them, and later in the game, especially with a lot of the major pieces, the queens and the rooks, it's much more difficult to hold on to that because you want to be attacking all over the board, but you always have to pay attention to controlling that pawn just in the center of the board. But you can see after the queen takes here, black has their own isolated pawn here on e7. So lots of different targets for both sides of the board to go down. Now we see queen come to f5. Says, yeah, I don't want to exchange right now. Wants to bring his queen up here to e6. Now this forces the trade. It is attacking the king and the queen. So queen captures and the pawn recaptures. Now there's a lot that goes into this move as well because this was forced. Could have easily, if we come back, said, yes, I as white, I want to go ahead and take here on f5. Pawn has to recapture, so he looks at this position and says, okay, I have this option A, and option B is what he did. Played queen up here to e6, forced his opponent to take. Okay, now white no longer has an isolated pawn, so that's good. He keeps this pawn off of the dark squares, so you always want to be looking at your opponent's minor pieces. In this case, his opponent's bishop is on a dark square, so it can never attack this pawn here unless this pawn moves. That's a good thing. He no longer has the isolated pawns we talked about. He also gives his opponent an isolated pawn here on the e file. The issue that white has to deal with is the fact that this pawn, while it's not isolated because this pawn can come up here and support it, it's really far up here on the 6th rank. It's going to be very difficult for him to get material here to try to protect that. He can always swing his rook over here to e1, but then that rook is just really playing defense. Wants it a little more aggressive in the game. From black's standpoint, he just wants to make it very, very difficult for white to hold on to this so that later on he can have a strong attack on this pawn. You can see there's a lot of clutter on the king side of the board, and while white does have a dominant position from pawn standpoint, it's going to be very difficult to increase that advantage. Where on the queen side, black definitely has the advantage. He has 2 pawns to 1. If there could be some sort of exchange, he would have his own pawn over here. That would be a pass pawn. Definitely would look to push that action here on the queen side of the board. Pawn to g5, attacking the bishop. Bishop comes back here. King to g7. Pawn up here to f4. Rook to d8, just centralizing that rook we talked about, wasn't really involved into the action. This bishop here on f6 for a while is going to act just like a pawn. It's not really going to be moving too much, and it's just holding down this pawn chain right here. Not much that white can do about it either. Pawn to a4, pawn here to h6, just solidifying the pawn chain a little bit. Now the kings start to get involved. Once the queen comes off the board, you do start to see both sides get their king involved into the game a little bit more than they usually would. The rooks do exchange on a c1, rook to d5, just centralizing a little bit. King to f3, rook over here a5, starting to attack. Says, yeah, I have 2 pawns over here. This is my strategy. I can't overwhelm you on the king side, so I'm going to go ahead and start attacking on the queen side. Rook to c4, bishop e5, just centralizing. King up here to e4, and this is a position where if you just look at it real quick, you may think, yeah, I'll go ahead and play bishop takes on h2. That's why you initially bring your bishop here to e5 to attack this pawn. If you can just get up 1 pawn, that may be good enough to win, but this would be very bad. This is a poison pawn. If you take this pawn here on h2, bad things start to happen. Bishop to d4, check. Maybe king to g6, a lot of different options. It could come down. And then rook to c8, preparing for the rook to come over here and check the opponent. There's no real good way to continue. Probably just start gobbling out material here. Rook to a4 makes the most sense. Best move for sure. It does pin down the bishop. So the bishop's not going to be getting out of line. But rook over here, g8 check. Maybe king to h7, but really doesn't matter where the king goes. There is going to be a check here. The king can't come to either of these squares right here because the pawn can't come here because of the bishop. So king h7, check after the rook. Now the rook can move. There's a discovered attack, takes the pawn here. Maybe the rook takes here. There's just no good way to continue in this spot. So at the end of the day, this would be extremely bad if black decided to take that pawn here on h2. He analyzes the position, realizes, yeah, that's not the way to go, and he plays king to f6. So now the king is kind of filling that gap here on f6. Definitely a much stronger move. Bishop down here to d2, attacking the rook on a5. And then we see the pawn to b5. Says, yeah, if you want to go ahead and take my rook, that's fine. I will recapture your rook, and I'll have a pass pawn here. I can easily push it down here to c3, start to have a very strong attack since I have a bishop here on e5. If you want to move all your material here, then black can start gobbling up pawns here with this king. So very strong attack here. Decides to go ahead and take it with his pawn instead. But then you can see after the rook takes on b5, this is exactly what Shakir's looking to do. Now he has that pass pawn on the queen side, and it's right over here on the queen side. One good thing the white does have going for him is Daniel has the dark square bishop. So this is going to promote to a dark square. You always want to have a minor piece that can protect the final square right here. So that's exactly what he does have, but he still has to be careful. This is a pass pawn that is going to require a lot of energy because black has the same thing, dark square bishop that can control the square that it also promotes to. Now we see rook to a4, bishop up here to b8, rook a1, and you start to see some maneuvering around the board. And at the end of the day, all black really wants to do is get into a position where he feels confident that he's not going to lose the king side of the board and that he can freely push forward with his pawn here. He can't do that right away. He can't move this bishop because as soon as he moves his bishop, this pawn is going to fall. He would like to eventually move his pawn here to a5, but right now he has to worry about both the rook and the bishop here on d2. So that's what both sides are going to be thinking about. White really can't put too much emphasis on the king side because as soon as he does, this pawn's going to start pushing forward. So it's a game of cat and mouse here as far as how both sides are maneuvering into the endgame, but black definitely looks like he has the upper hand right here. We do see an exchange on the king side. Rook comes over here to h1 to attack. Rook to e5, check. Rook to d5, check, maneuvering around into the game. Rook eventually takes here, and then we see the exchange. Black is still up that pawn right here. It all is going to come down to, can Black actually execute to the win? It's not an easy position at all. We're 41 moves into the game, so they do have some extra time on the clock to start thinking, which is good because it's a very complicated endgame. Rook to a4, attacking the pawn. Bishop to c5, so a little more centralized. Definitely better than the bishop up here on b8, protecting it, but still wants to find a way that he can bring that pawn down here to a5. Pawn f3, bishop to b6, bishop c3, king to d7. So just trying to get the king involved into the game a little bit more, because it looks like it's going to take all of the material on the board to start pushing that pawn here on the queen side of the board. So you can see that we are going through quite a few moves as both sides are just maneuvering back and forth. We do have a few twofold repetitions every now and then eventually you will see a pawn move, and then they decide, yeah, I don't want to draw here, go into some extra games. Let's see if we can actually play this thing out. Play continues with king to d2, king c4, rook over here to c1, king d5, and then we start to see an attack on this pawn here on f4. So rook to e8, rook up here to h6, just protecting the pawn that the new rook is attacking. King here to c3, and that's the opening. Once the king moves here, bishop down here to e3, the king, the bishop are now attacking that. Then rook to a8. I think a much better approach to defend this would be rook to e7. Wants to attack it, sure, but also wants to make sure that if the rook comes down here to h4, which would be an extremely strong move, that he can still protect things if he wants to. He could just take this pawn here on e6, but because he plays rook to a8, he doesn't have that flexibility. Now, Black, going into the endgame, they've played so many moves just maneuvering around, ended up deciding not to play rook to h4, but continued with rook to e8 here. Rook c1 could have also started to take material here. Maybe bishop takes on f4. Could get interesting. We see an exchange here. The rook takes, and then he has to analyze this and say, can I win this game? I guess he decided that he could not, so decided to just instead play rook to c1, check. Now rook to c6, rook up here to f8, now check. Some more checks on the board. Rook to b6, some twofold repetition here, king to c4, and finally, 35 moves after we were waiting, figuring out how or when Black would feel he could eventually move his pawn here. He does. Pawn to a5. And so it is game on. Now, can Black just continue to push his pawn down the board here? Rook to a8. Rook here to c6. Check. And then the bishop takes the pawn here on f4. Now, this is a tricky one because the bishop can't really take here. The king takes, and then yeah, you have this pawn here in the center of the board. That's going to be easier to push than this pawn here because the king is right next to it. The rook and the king both protecting it. You just can't stop that at all. So realizes this and plays bishop down here to c3. He's really just trying to hold on now, knowing that he can't win this game. He's down 2 pawns. Both of those are just going to be pushing as much as possible. We now see the bishop come up here to c7, defending that pawn. Rook to c8, and now we see the move to end things, and that is a4 with the deflection. There's just no real good way to combat this. If we see the king take here on a4, then the rook takes on c3, still protecting the bishop here on c7. Still has the pass pawn here on e6. So no real way to continue. We do see king to c2, and then after king to e3, we do see Daniel resign in the game. So Shakir Mamedyarov with the victory. He does win the round. They did tie in the first game, and so as we've talked about, this is a best of 2 series. You win in that second game after the draw, and you will go on. So a lot of the players are going to be playing tomorrow in the tiebreakers. MVL, who won yesterday, he did draw today. So he and Shakira are the only 2 players moving on already to the next round. So we will have our coverage tomorrow of some of the tiebreak games and see who is going to be moving on with those 2 players we just mentioned on to round 2. Hopefully you guys are enjoying this tournament. A lot of coverage that we're going to be having, but thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video.